The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith, Chapter 14. He moved the next day to the Hotel Europa, a moderately priced hotel near the Via Veneto, because the Hassler was a trifle flashy, he thought, the kind of hotel that was patronized by visiting movie people, and where Freddie Miles, or people like him who knew Dickie, might choose to stay if they came to Rome. Tom held imaginary conversations with Marge and Fausto and Freddie in his hotel room. Marge was the most likely to come to Rome, he thought. He spoke to her as Dickie if he imagined it on the telephone, and as Tom if he imagined her face-to-face with him. She might, for instance, pop up to Rome and find his hotel and insist on coming up to his room, in which case he would have to remove Dickie's rings and change his clothing. "I don't know," he would say to her in Tom's voice. "You know how he is, likes to feel he's getting away from everything. He said I could use his hotel room for a few days because mine happens to be so badly heated. Oh, he'll be back in a couple of days, or there'll be a postcard from him saying he's all right. He went to some little town with Di Massimo to look at some paintings in a church." "But you don't know whether he went north or south?" "I really don't. I guess south, but what good does that do us?" "It's just my bad luck to miss him, isn't it? Why couldn't he have at least said where he was going?" "I know, I asked him to. Looked the room over for a map or anything else that might have shown where he was going. He just called me up 3 days ago and said I could use his room if I cared to." It was a good idea to practice jumping into his own character again because the time might come where he would need to in a matter of seconds, and it was strangely easy to forget the exact timbre of Tom Ripley's voice. He conversed with Marge until the sound of his own voice in his ears was exactly the same as he remembered it. But mostly he was Dickie, discoursing in a low tone with Freddie and Marge, and by long distance with Dickie's mother, and with Fausto, and with a stranger at a dinner party, conversing in English and Italian with Dickie's portable radio turned on so that if a hotel employee passed by in the hall and happened to know that Signor Greenleaf was alone, he would not think him an eccentric. Sometimes if the song on the radio was one that Tom liked, he merely danced by himself, but he danced as Dickie would have with a girl. He had seen Dickie once on Giorgio's terrace dancing with Marge, and also in the Giardino degli Orangi in Naples, in long strides, yet rather stiffly, not what could be called exactly good dancing. Every movement to Tom was a pleasure, alone in his room or walking the streets of Rome, when he combined sightseeing with looking around for an apartment. It was impossible ever to be lonely or bored, he thought, so long as he was Dickie Greenleaf. They greeted him as Signor Greenleaf at the American Express, where he called for his mail. Marge's first letter said, "Dickie, well, it was a bit of a surprise. I wonder what came over you so suddenly in Rome or San Remo or wherever it was. Tom was most mysterious, except to say that he would be staying with you. I believe he's leaving for America when I see it. At the risk of sticking my neck out, old boy, may I say that I don't like that guy. From my point of view or anybody else's, he is using you for what you are worth. If you want to make some changes for your own good, for gosh sakes, get him away from you. All right, he may not be queer, he's just a nothing, which is worse. He isn't normal enough to have any kind of sex life, if you know what I mean. However, I'm not interested in Tom, but in you. Yes, I can bear the few weeks without you, darling, and even Christmas, though I prefer not to think of Christmas. I prefer not to think about you, and as you said, let the feelings come or not. But it's impossible not to think of you here, because every inch of the village is haunted with you as far as I'm concerned. And in this house, everywhere I look, there is some sign of you. The hedge we planted, the fence we started repairing and never finished, the books I borrowed from you and never returned, and your chair at the table, that's the worst. To continue with the neck sticking, I don't say that Tom is going to do anything actively bad to you, but I know that he has a subtly bad influence on you. You act vaguely ashamed of being around him when you are around him, do you know that? Do you ever try to analyze it? I thought you were beginning to realize all this in the last few weeks, but now you're with him again, and frankly, dear boy, I don't know what to make of it. If you really don't care when he takes off, for God's sake, send him packing. He'll never help you or anybody else to get straightened out about anything. In fact, it's greatly to his interest to keep you muddled and string you along, and your father too. Thanks loads for the cologne, darling. I'll save it or most of it for when I see you next. I haven't got the refrigerator over to my house yet. You can have it, of course, anytime you want it back. Maybe Tom told you that Skippy skipped out. Should I capture a gecko and tie a string around its neck? I have to get to work on the house wall right away before it mildews completely and collapses on me. Wish you were here, darling, of course. Lots of love and right. Care of American Express, Rome, 12 December. Dear Mother and Dad, I'm in Rome looking for an apartment, although I haven't found exactly what I want yet. Apartments here are either too big or too small, and if too big, you have to shut off every room but one in winter in order to heat it properly anyway. I'm trying to get a medium-sized, medium-priced place that I can heat completely without spending a fortune for it. Sorry I've been so bad about letters lately. I hope to do better with the quieter life I'm leading here. I felt I needed a change from Mongebello, as you've both been saying for a long time, so I've moved bag and baggage and may even sell the house and the boat. I've met a wonderful painter called Di Massimo who is willing to give me instruction in his studio. I'm going to work like blazes for a few months and see what happens. A kind of trial period. I realize this doesn't interest you, Dad, but since you're always asking how I spend my time, this is how. I'll be leading a very quiet, studious life until next summer. Apropos of that, could you send me the latest folders from Burt Greenleaf? I like to keep up with what you're doing too, and it's been a long time since I've seen anything. Mother, I hope you haven't gone to great trouble for my Christmas. I don't really need anything I can think of. How are you feeling? Are you able to get out very much to the theater, etc.? How is Uncle Edward now? Send him my regards and keep me posted. With love, Dickie. Tom read it over, decided there were probably too many commas, and retyped it patiently and signed it. He had once seen a half-finished letter of Dickie's to his parents in Dickie's typewriter, and he knew Dickie's general style. He knew that Dickie had never taken more than 10 minutes writing any letter. If this letter was different, Tom thought it could be different only in being a little more personal and enthusiastic than usual. He felt rather pleased with the letter when he read it over for the second time. Uncle Edward was a brother of Mrs. Greenleaf, who was ill in an Illinois hospital with some kind of cancer, Tom had learned from the latest letter to Dickie from his mother. A few days later, he was off to Paris by plane. He had called the Inglaterra before he left Rome. No letters or phone calls from Richard Greenleaf. He landed at Orly at 5 in the afternoon. The passport inspector stamped his passport after only a quick glance at him, though Tom had lightened his hair slightly with a peroxide wash and had forced some waves into it, aided by hair oil. And for the inspector's benefit, he had put on the rather tense, rather frowning expression of Dickie's passport photograph. Tom checked in at the Hotel de Quai Voltaire, which had been recommended to him by some Americans with whom he had struck up an acquaintance at a Rome cafe, as being conveniently located and not too full of Americans. Then he went out for a stroll in the raw, foggy December evening. He walked with his head up and a smile on his face. It was the atmosphere of the city that he loved, the atmosphere that he had always heard about. Crooked streets, gray-fronted houses with skylights, noisy car horns, and everywhere public urinals and columns with brightly colored theater notices on them. He wanted to let the atmosphere sleep in slowly, perhaps for several days before he visited the Louvre or went up the Eiffel Tower or anything like that. He bought a Figaro, sat down at a table in the Flore, and ordered a fine Alio, because Dickie had once said that a fine Alio was his usual drink in France. Tom's French was limited, but so was Dickie's, Tom knew. Some interesting people stared at him through the glass-enclosed front of the cafe, but no one came in to speak to him. Tom was prepared for someone to get up from one of the tables at any moment and come over and say, "Dickie Greenleaf, is it really you?" He had done so little artificially to change his appearance, but his very expression, Tom thought, was like Dickie's now. He wore a smile that was dangerously welcoming to a stranger, a smile more fit to greet an old friend or a lover. It was Dickie's best and most typical smile when he was in a good humor. Tom was in a good humor. It was Paris. Wonderful to sit in a famous cafe and to think of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow being Dickie Greenleaf. The cufflinks, the white silk shirts, even the old clothes, the worn brown belt with the brass buckle, the old brown grain leather shoes, the kind advertised in punches lasting a lifetime, the old mustard-colored coat sweater with the sagging pockets, they were all his, and he loved them all, and the black fountain pen with little gold initials, and the wallet, a well-worn alligator wallet from Gucci's, and there was plenty of money to go in it. By the next afternoon, he had been invited to a party in the Avenue Kléber by some people, a French girl and an American young man, with whom he had started a conversation in a large cafe restaurant on the Boulevard Saint-Germain. The party consisted of 30 or 40 people, most of them middle-aged, standing around rather frigidly in a huge, chilly, formal apartment. In Europe, Tom gathered, inadequate heating was a hallmark of chic in winter, like the iceless martini in summer. He had moved to a more expensive hotel in Rome finally in order to be warmer, and had found that the more expensive hotel was even colder. In a gloomy old-fashioned way, the house was chic, Tom supposed. There were a butler and a maid, a vast table of pâtés en croûte, sliced turkey, and petits fours, and quantities of champagne, although the upholstery of the sofa and the long drapes at the windows were threadbare and rotting with age, and he had seen mouse holes in the hall by the elevator. At least half a dozen of the guests he had been presented to were counts and countesses. An American informed Tom that the young man and the girl who had invited him were going to be married, and that her parents were not enthusiastic. There was an atmosphere of strain in the big room, and Tom made an effort to be as pleasant as possible to everyone, even the severer-looking French people to whom he could say little more than "C'est très agréable, n'est-ce pas?" He did his very best and won at least a smile from the French girl who had invited him. He considered himself lucky to be there. How many Americans alone in Paris could get themselves invited to a French home after only a week or so in the city? The French were especially slow in inviting strangers to their homes, Tom had always heard. Not a single one of the Americans seemed to know his name. Tom felt completely comfortable, as he had never felt before at any party that he could remember. He behaved as he had always wanted to behave at a party. This was the clean slate he had thought about on the boat coming over from America. This was the real annihilation of his past and of himself, Tom Ripley, who was made up of that past and his rebirth as a completely new person. One Frenchwoman and 2 of the Americans invited him to parties, but Tom declined with the same reply to all of them. "Thank you very much, but I'm leaving Paris tomorrow." It wouldn't do to become too friendly with any of these, Tom thought. One of them might know somebody who knew Dickie very well, someone who might be at the next party. At 11:15, when he said goodbye to his hostess and to her parents, they looked very sorry to see him go. But he wanted to be at Notre Dame by midnight. It was Christmas Eve. The girl's mother asked his name again. Monsieur Granelef, the girl repeated for her. Dickie Granelef, correct? Correct, Tom said, smiling. Just as he reached the downstairs hall, he remembered Freddie Miles' party at Cortina, December 2nd, nearly a month ago. He had meant to write to Freddie to say that he wasn't coming. Had Marge gone, he wondered. Freddie would think it very strange that he hadn't written to say he wasn't coming, and Tom hoped Marge had told Freddie at least. He must write Freddie at once. There was a Florence address for Freddie in Dickie's address book. It was a slip, but nothing serious, Tom thought. He just mustn't let such a thing happen again. He walked out into the darkness and turned in the direction of the illuminated bone-white Arc de Triomphe. It was strange to feel so alone and yet so much a part of things as he had felt at the party. He felt it again standing on the outskirts of the crowd that filled the square in front of Notre Dame. There was such a crowd that he couldn't possibly have got into the cathedral, but the amplifiers carried the music clearly to all parts of the square. French Christmas carols whose names he didn't know. Silent Night, a solemn carol, and then a lively babbling one. The chanting of male voices. Frenchmen near him removed their hats. Tom removed his. He stood straight, tall, sober-faced, yet ready to smile if anyone had addressed him. He felt as he had felt on the ship, only more intensely, full of goodwill, a gentleman with nothing in his past to blemish his character. He was Dickie, good-natured, naive Dickie, with a smile for everyone and 1,000 francs for anyone who asked him. An old man did ask him for money as Tom was leaving the cathedral square, and he gave him a crisp blue 1,000-franc bill. The old man's face exploded in a smile, and he tipped his hat. Tom felt a little hungry, though he rather liked the idea of going to bed hungry tonight. He would spend an hour or so with his Italian conversation book, he thought, then go to bed. Then he remembered that he had decided to try to gain about 5 pounds because Dickie's clothes were just a trifle loose on him and Dickie looked heavier than he in the face. So he stopped at a bar tabac and ordered a ham sandwich on long crusty bread and a glass of hot milk, because a man next to him at the counter was drinking hot milk. The milk was almost tasteless, pure and chastening, as Tom imagined a wafer tasted in church. He came down in a leisurely way from Paris, stopping overnight in Lyon and also in Arles to see the places that Van Gogh had painted there. He maintained his cheerful equanimity in the face of atrociously bad weather. In Arles, the rain born on the violent mistral soaked him through as he tried to discover the exact spots where Van Gogh had stood to paint from. He had bought a beautiful book of Van Gogh reproductions in Paris, but he could not take the book out in the rain, and he had to make a dozen trips back to his hotel to verify the scenes. He looked over Marseille, found it drab except for the Canebière, and moved on eastward by train, stopping for a day in Saint-Tropez, Cannes, Nice, Monte Carlo, all the places he had heard of and felt such affinity for when he saw them, though in the month of December they were overcast by gray winter clouds and the gay crowds were not there, even on New Year's Eve in Menton. Tom put the people there in his imagination, men and women in evening clothes descending the broad steps of the gambling palace in Monte Carlo, people in bright bathing costumes, light and brilliant as a doofy watercolor, walking under the palms of the Boulevard des Anglais at Nice. People, American, English, French, German, Swedish, Italian. Romance, disappointment, quarrels, reconciliations, murder. The Côte d'Azur excited him as no other place he had yet seen in the world excited him. And it was so tiny, really, this curve in the Mediterranean coastline with the wonderful names strung like beads. Toulon, Fréjus, Saint-Raphael, Cannes, Nice, Menton, and then San Remo. There were 2 letters from Marge when he got back to Rome on the 4th of January. She was giving up her house on the 1st of March, she said. She had not quite finished the first draft of her book, but she was sending 3/4 of it with all the photographs to the American publisher who had been interested in her idea when she wrote him about it last summer. She wrote, "When am I going to see you? I hate passing up a summer in Europe after I've weathered another awful winter, but I think I'll go home early in March. Yes, I'm homesick. Finally. Really. Darling, it would be so wonderful if we could go home on the same boat together. Is there a possibility? I don't suppose there is. You're not going back to the U.S. even for a short visit this winter. I was thinking of sending all my stuff, 8 pieces of luggage, 2 trunks, 3 boxes of books and miscellaneous, by slow boat from Naples and coming up through Rome, and if you're in the mood, we could at least go up the coast again and see Fort de Marmi and Viareggio and other spots we like. The last look. I'm not in the mood to care about the weather, which I know will be horrid. I wouldn't ask you to accompany me to Marseille where I catch the boat, but from Genoa. What do you think?" The other letter was more reserved. Tom knew why. He had not sent her even a postcard for nearly a month. She said, "Have changed my mind about the Riviera. Maybe this damp weather has taken away my enterprise, or my book has. Anyway, I'm leaving from Naples on an earlier boat, the Constitution, on 28 February. Imagine, back to America as soon as I step aboard. American food, Americans, dollars for drinks and the horse races. Darling, I'm sorry not to be seeing you. As I gather from your silence, you still don't want to see me, so don't give it a thought. Consider me off your hands. Of course, I do hope I see you again in the States or anywhere else. Should you possibly be inspired to make a trip down to Manji before the 28th, you know damn well you are welcome. As ever, Marge. P.S. I don't even know if you're still in Rome. Tom could see her in tears as she wrote it. He had an impulse to write her a very considerate letter saying he had just come back from Greece and had she gotten his 2 postcards. But it was safer, Tom thought, to let her leave without being sure where he was. He wrote her nothing. The only thing that made him uneasy, and that was not very uneasy, was the possibility of Marge's coming up to see him in Rome before he could get settled in an apartment. If she combed the hotels, she could find him, but she could never find him in an apartment. Well-to-do Americans didn't have to report their places of residence at the Questura, though according to the stipulations of the Permesso di Soggiorno, one was supposed to register every change of address with the police. Tom had talked with an American resident of Rome who had an apartment and who said he never bothered with the Questura and it never bothered him. If Marge did come up to Rome suddenly, Tom had a lot of his own clothing hanging ready in the closet. The only thing he had changed about himself physically was his hair, but that could always be explained as being the effect of the sun. He wasn't really worried. Tom had at first amused himself with an eyebrow pencil. Dickie's eyebrows were longer and turned up a little at the outer edges, and with a touch of putty at the end of his nose to make it longer and more pointed, but he abandoned these as too likely to be noticed. The main thing about impersonation, Tom thought, was to maintain the mood and temperament of the person one was impersonating, and to assume the facial expressions that went with them. The rest fell into place. On the 10th of January, Tom wrote Marge that he was back in Rome after 3 weeks in Paris alone, that Tom had left Rome a month ago saying he was going up to Paris, and from there to America, though he hadn't run into Tom in Paris, and that he had not yet found an apartment in Rome, but he was looking and would let her know his address as soon as he had one. He thanked her extravagantly for the Christmas package. She had sent the white sweater with the red V-stripes that she had been knitting and trying on Dickie for size since October, as well as an art book of Quattrocento painting and a leather shaving kit with his initials HRG on the lid. The package had arrived only on January 6, which was the main reason for Tom's letter. He didn't want her to think he hadn't claimed it, imagine that he had vanished into thin air and then start a search for him. He asked if she had retrieved a package from him. He had mailed it from Paris and he supposed it was late. He apologized. He wrote, "I'm painting again with Di Messino and I'm reasonably pleased. I miss you too, but if you can still bear with my experiment, I'd prefer not to see you for several more weeks, unless you do suddenly go home in February, which I still doubt, by which time you may not care to see me again. Regards to Giorgio and wife and Fausto if he's still there, and Pietro down at the dock." It was a letter in the absent-minded and faintly lugubrious tone of all Dickie's letters, a letter that could not be called warm or unwarm, and that said essentially nothing. Actually, he had found an apartment in a large apartment house in the Via Imperiale near the Pincian Gate, and had signed a year's lease for it, though he did not intend to spend most of his time in Rome, much less the winter. He only wanted a home, a base somewhere, after years of not having any. And Rome was chic. Rome was part of his new life. He wanted to be able to say in Majorca or Athens or Cairo or wherever he was, "Yes, I live in Rome, I keep an apartment there." Keep was the word for apartments among the international set. You kept an apartment in Europe the way you kept a garage in America. He also wanted his apartment to be elegant, though he intended to have the minimum of people up to see him, and he hated the idea of having a telephone, even an unlisted telephone. But he decided it was more of a safety measure than a menace, so he had one installed. The apartment had a large living room, a bedroom, a kind of sitting room, kitchen, and bath. It was furnished somewhat ornately, but it suited the respectable neighborhood and the respectable life he intended to lead. The rent was the equivalent of $175 a month in winter, including heat, and $125 in summer. Marge replied with an ecstatic letter saying she had just received the beautiful silk blouse from Paris, which she hadn't expected at all, and it fitted to perfection. She said she had had Fausto and the Cecchis for Christmas dinner at her house, and the turkey had been divine, with marrons and giblet gravy and plum pudding and blah 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 and everything but him. And what was he doing and thinking about, and was he happier? And that Fausto would look him up on his way to Milan if he sent an address in the next few days, otherwise leave a message for Fausto at the American Express saying where Fausto could find him. Tom supposed her good humor was due mostly to the fact that she now thought Tom had departed for America via Paris. Along with Marge's letter came one from Signor Pucci saying he had sold 3 pieces of his furniture for 150,000 lire in Naples, and that he had a prospective buyer for the boat, a certain Anastasio Martino of Mangibello, who had promised to pay the first down payment within the week, but that the house probably couldn't be sold until summer, when the Americans began coming in again. Less 15% for Signor Pucci's commission, the furniture sale amounted to $210, and Tom celebrated the night by going to a Roman nightclub and ordering a superb dinner which he ate in elegant solitude at a candlelit table for 2. He did not at all mind dining and going to the theater alone. It gave him the opportunity to concentrate on being Dickie Greenleaf. He broke his bread as Dickie did, thrust his fork into his mouth with his left hand as Dickie did, gazed off at the other tables and at the dancers in such a profound and benevolent trance that the waiter had to speak to him a couple times to get his attention. Some people waved to him from a table, and Tom recognized them as one of the American couples he had met at the Christmas Eve party in Paris. He made a sign of greeting in return. He even remembered their name, Soders. He did not look at them again during the evening, but they left before he did and stopped by his table to say hello. "All by yourself?" the man asked. He looked a little tipsy. "Yes, I have a yearly date here with myself," Tom replied. "I celebrate a certain anniversary." The American nodded a little blankly, and Tom could see that he was stymied for anything intelligent to say, as uneasy as any small-town American in the presence of cosmopolitan poise and sobriety, money and good clothes, even if the clothes were on another American. "You said you were living in Rome, didn't you?" his wife asked. "You know, I think we've forgotten your name, but we remember you very well from Christmas Eve." "Greenleaf," Tom replied. "Richard Greenleaf." "Oh, yes," she said, relieved. "Do you have an apartment here?" She was all ready to take down his address in her memory. "I'm staying at a hotel at the moment, but I'm planning to move into an apartment any day as soon as the decorating's finished. I'm at the Elysia. Why don't you give me a ring?" "We'd love to. We're on our way to Mallorca in 3 more days, but that's plenty of time." "Love to see you," Tom said. "Buona sera." Alone again, Tom returned to his private reveries. He ought to open a bank account for Tom Ripley, he thought, and from time to time put $100 or so into it. Dickie Greenleaf had 2 banks, one in Naples and one in New York, with about $5,000 in each account. He might open the Ripley account with a couple of thousand and put into it the 150,000 lira from the Mangiabello furniture. After all, he had 2 people to take care of.